what we're going to do now is just have a little bit of a conversation. We'll probably do this for 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up to your questions from all the different groups. But I wanted to begin first by talking a little bit about some of the things that came out of the two things you read. And I think it's pretty obvious that that you both have some pretty strong opinions about the experiences that you personally had growing up, as well as how that has in some ways shaped your worldviews. It's a little different, obviously, because Wesley, you wrote a piece of literary nonfiction, and Gene, your piece, though inspired by life, is in fact actually involving supernatural things and angels and stuff that actually didn't happen. So, but let's begin there. So, Gene, I don't want to do any spoilers here, but the way that that Level Up sort of ends suggests in some ways that you actually are sympathetic with this idea that the best intentions of parents, however harsh they may come out, actually are things that kids should consider seriously, should embrace, that you might even endorse, even as a parent yourself. Would that be true?
Yes, I think so. A lot of times at comic book conventions and such, people will come up to me and ask, young cartoonists will come up to me and ask, what's the first step in getting a book published? What should I do if I want to pursue this as a career? And I always tell them, get a day job. Get a day job that you like, that will leave you enough energy to pursue your art after work. But you've got to have that day job because, and it's because of the wisdom, I think, behind some of what my dad used to say. I think it is important to be able to feed yourself. It is important to be able to pay for rent. And it is important to have things like health insurance. And I think if you try to pursue art without those things, you have to go in one of two routes. You have to either basically live on people's couches, or you have to start doing art that's not really your own. You end up taking up jobs and drawing other people's visions as opposed to pursuing your own. So the practical considerations that my dad asked me to think about play into the art itself as well.
I think that, beyond even the notion of sort of practical considerations, and there's also that sort of larger question of whether or not a career, a risky career, a creative career, a career that, potentially might lead one to sleep on couches, destitution, etc. Is it something which you would even endorse? I think that in one prior conversation we had, it was mentioned by your collaborator that you were kind of discouraging your eldest son from pursuing the comic book world. And so
I have 3 kids now. My oldest is now 7, and when he was around 3, he started drawing. And he actually showed some talent at it. My mom actually thinks he's way better than me. I don't know. But I gotta say, it freaks me out a little bit. Because I know that it's not, I know just from trying to do it myself that it's not very easy to pursue a stable income through anything artistic. And when I talked to him about what he wanted to do for a living, at first he was drawing cars and he said, "Oh, I want to be a car designer." I said, "That's great, you can work for like Toyota or something, that's awesome." And nowadays he says he wants to write and draw comic books. And there is part of me that worries about that worries, when you're 25, are you going to be able to make rent? When you're 30, are you going to be asking me for money still?
Yes, that's that sort of a common problem of all of us who have kids. And now, Wesley, you don't have kids just yet, right? But you were one at one point, and you have parents. And yes, despite that reptilian appearance. But one of the things that obviously comes out strongly, in the segment you read, is that you clearly have again very strong reaction to to this larger question of what parental expectations vest upon Asian American kids, or at least one Asian American kid yourself. I'm just curious, to what degree did your own personal experiences shape this outlook? I know that you can't necessarily use that to extrapolate to all of what you said in the article, but where does that litany of F-bombs come from, so to speak?
I'm a pretty obstreperous person. And
is this mic on?
No.
No, I don't think it's on.
Oh.
Yeah. I got it.
All right.
I'm the true Yang.
Hello?
Oh, there we
Yes.
You hear me? So, I actually don't think I take a position with regard to other Asian people in terms of how they raise their kids. I think being a doctor is one of the best and most respected professions, and you should be one if you can, right? If I were to have a child, I would want that child to be a doctor too.
All right, panel's over, guys.
But the F-bombs were actually written in a very mechanical way, because there's a book called Breaking the Bandwidth Ceiling that referred to a study that was done about a series of what Asian values are, and this was done by a couple of sociologists. And there was a list, and I took the list and I put the word fuck before each of the values on that list. And the point of doing this was, it was a bit of mischief, right? And it's a point of demonstrating to the reader that they're dealing with something a little bit different than they think they're dealing with. And it was very quite sort of deliberately done. Which is not to say that it was just a persona or something that I was making up. It's all of those F's are certainly within me, but it's not like I live them all the time, right? The kind of dramatic monologue form. And I think what confused a lot of people about the article is that the center of the article is a more or less kind of straightforward set of reported things that are issues within Asian America. Some of the responses I got from people who are more informed on the issue is that, oh, this is just Asian American Studies 101. Right? All of this stuff is completely new to me, and it was completely new to a non-Asian readership. So I was wrapping up a set of issues, and then framing it within these two dramatic monologues in which I demonstrate that this is me, right? These values actually, it doesn't cost me anything to say F these values, because these values were never imposed on me, and are actually not a part of what my parents were interested in imposing on me. And so I'm actually not really a part of this. And yet, because I have an Asian face, I'm somehow implicated in it, right? So there were people who felt that I was sort of unfairly sort of implicating a whole race of people in a series of personal obsessions. And that's, that's a kind of, that's fair, I think, in some ways. But then again, a whole race of people has implicated me in a lot of things, right? So I think there's also a degree of fairness to it as well. So.
Yes. The Yang strikes back. Well, so one of the things that actually comes up in your article, later on in the article, and it is available online, so this isn't a spoiler. You should actually go out and check it out. It is epic. I mean, it's one thing I will say about the article is that it covers a huge amount of ground, and I think actually does some really tremendously solid reporting in that middle part.
Sure.
But one of the things that comes out of that is a question which actually brings back that initial little quote that I read at the top of this, that quote from Steve Jobs, or that has been attributed to Apple via Steve Jobs, which is you discuss how despite all of the churning out of engineers and computer programmers from places like Berkeley and so forth, and despite the fact that there are tons of Asian Americans in Silicon Valley, very few of them actually become CEOs. Very few of them are at the top of the executive ladder. And you sort of apply that even to some fairly successful Asian American entrepreneurs. You discuss, for instance, Tony Hsieh, who is the founder of Zappos.com. For those of you guys who enjoy shoes, you may know him. And discuss how, despite the fact that he is tremendously successful, that he has become kind of a role model for a certain kind of management and leadership, and has positioned himself as such, he still sort of fits into this mold of kind of this, passive.
What's interesting about Tony Hsieh, and I don't think I'm actually fitting in. I'm using him as a kind of counterexample to what I'm writing about, and the emergence of the kind of person who manages to take Asian values, because there's something very Asian about the way he does business. Tony Hsieh, who is the CEO of Zappos, is very sort of non-bottom line oriented, right? So his focus is on saying we have a laser focus on customer service, and we're willing to
like pay the people who take the calls to, there's no time limit. In fact, we encourage them to talk as long as they want with the customers, and the record, I think, was like a call that went on for 8 hours and 55 minutes. Now, this is pure loss, right? Like from a narrow standpoint, right? But he doesn't see it this way. You take these losses, and then 3 to 5 years down the line, you have a group of fanatically devoted customers, right? And so this is what Tony Hsieh is saying, that if we focus on maintaining relationships, right, in what I think is a very kind of Asian way that speaks to kind of like the promise of Japanese capitalism, right, back when it seemed a little more promising, was that like we don't have to focus on the bottom line, that we can like look more holistically at the whole business, and we can reconcile the interests of profits and the happiness of the people that work for us. But in order to get in the position to do what he did, he had to take certain risks, right? Now it helps to have a $278 million windfall when you're 24 years old to do that, right? But he also had to show a lot of character, right? Because he had to continue to invest in Zappos and sell off his properties at a big loss to keep it running. This is the kind of narrative that he constructs, and it's a very interesting one, right? And so, but like Motoko Rich did an interesting piece on him in the style section, where she referred to him as a kind of person who was like an alien who had studied us in order to live among us, right? So she portrayed him as this person who had a mild form of like social anxiety disorder, and yet he's this tremendous CEO, right? And so in the course of like being a person who probably would not be promoted above like level 1 technician at a Western corporation where Western models of leadership, he went off and he did his own thing. He succeeded hugely, and he demonstrated that there are other models of leadership, including Asian models of leadership, that don't include the kind of charismatic style of Western leadership that we have come accustomed to.
So that brings up that larger point, and this is something we're talking about prior to this session, which is, I mean, again, with the passing of Steve Jobs, is it the case that it's impossible for Asian America to produce a Steve Jobs? And I asked this actually, knowing that Gene, you grew up in and around Silicon Valley. You knew plenty of Asians. You went to Berkeley. There are Asians there.
There are.
I'm sure you knew a lot who went on into the digital space. I mean, do you think it's fair to say, or unfair, as the case may be, that quality, that caliber, that mindset is just not found in our community because of our values or otherwise?
Well, I started thinking about that question because I had read Wesley Yang's article, and then I saw all this coverage about Steve Jobs' death. So I started thinking about this, whether or not there really could be an Asian American Steve Jobs. Now, obviously, the answer is yes, because every individual is different. But does our culture actually encourage that sort of out-of-the-box thinking? And I think there are certain parts of Steve Jobs' character that are definitely encouraged by traditional, stereotypical Asian American parenting, like his persistence, his refusal to accept failure. All of that, that's all very Asian. The pieces that aren't stereotypically Asian are possibly the way he thinks differently, the way he thought differently from other engineers who were of his generation. However, I wonder if that's particularly Asian American, because if you look at Asians, obviously there are Asian artists, and obviously there are Asian rebels. Like the first, and obviously, like Steve Jobs, one of the things that made him so good was that he was kind of a dick. Right? Like
there are Asian dicks.
Yeah, he wouldn't accept anything except the best, and he had these huge dreams, even from when he was a kid. He wanted to change the world. And if you look at the first emperor of China, he was like the dick of the dicks. Like he totally wanted to change the world, and he felt like he could do it, and he wouldn't accept anything except total change of that entire continent, and he was able to accomplish that. So I wonder if a lot of the pieces of Asian American parenting that do not encourage us to think outside of the box, I wonder if those are just survival mechanisms that our parents ingrained in us because we were growing up in this culture that didn't match the one that they came from.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally true that immigrants are not representative of the group that they came from. These are the people that left the country. that these are people who are not risk averse, right? Because they moved over the ocean to another place. On the other hand, there are certain things that they brought with them, right? So there's an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal cover today about how the police in Korea are now hunting down late night cram schools to prevent them from continuing to operate, right? Because, in Korea, here's the situation. Korea is this like gigantic sort of oligopolistic, or for a long time is this gigantic oligopolistic society where the way that you got in was you got into one of two elite universities. And if you got into those universities, you were going to rule that country, period, right? And if you did not, you would not. And it was as simple and clear-cut as that. So everything depended upon your score on the college admissions test. So beginning in the 6th grade, kids would begin to go to these cram schools, these private test preparation academies, from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. at night. So like 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., 6 days a week, from the 7th grade until the 12th grade is not unusual. And so why is the government now cracking down on these schools? The government is cracking down on these schools because there is this perception that a fanatical sort of emphasis on test-taking skills. What is a test? A test is about what is iterable, what is repeatable, what is already known, what is already understood. Might come at the cost of what is not already known, what is not iterable, and what can only be innovated by an individual, right? Now, the thing about Korea, though, is in fact that the experience of Korea is not one of non-innovation. In fact, after 1997, the country had to completely make itself over, and kids who had gone through the system created all of these innovative companies like Samsung and Hyundai, and took them from being laughingstocks to being some of the best and most innovative companies in the world. Nonetheless, there is a view that is spreading there, and I don't think it's a wrong one, that like such an intense training of kids has something to do with the fact that the Korean suicide rate is the highest in the world and is 3 times higher than that of the United States, and something to do with the fact that it may not be the optimal distribution of skills versus the capacity to be innovative and lead, or they want to move it in a different direction, which is why they're sending their police out to stop kids from studying at 11 p.m. at night. And, so like Asian American kids that go to cram school from 4 to 6, they have it really easy in comparison to their like Korean counterparts. Look, the article is not really polemic, and it doesn't actually, I don't think, make an argument. What it's meant to do is to dramatize certain of these like undocumented experiences, because we have all of these numbers that I rattled off about how well Asian Americans are doing. But there's also like an undercurrent of different emotions that people go through as they struggle with like the heavy load of these expectations. And eventually there's a process that we're still in, which is the process that I want to document in the book, where people sort of like shake off, sort of like appraise what skills and values that they took from their upbringing, and then like emerge as fully formed individuals, right, who are able to live their own lives rather than lives that are imposed to them by others, including their parents. And I think it's a process that's still, that people are emerging and will continue to emerge. And it's an interesting process, and it's a very uniquely American process. So my interest in Asian Americans is not in Asian Americans per se, but as a special case of this continuing sort of American story.
Well, I mean, and on that note, I don't think I even mentioned the fact that this article, Paper Tigers, here in New York Magazine, is in fact becoming a book, that Wesley's working on a book right now. What's your publisher? I'm sorry.
It was sold to Echo, but it's now moved. My editor left for Norton, but he's taking the book with him.
Oh, really? So you're ultra by Norton. Okay. So he loves it. That's good. For what it's worth, this story is continuing to be researched and explored and extended. The last thing I wanted to ask you guys, and it's something which actually, to me, I think reflects some of the internal tensions that I'm feeling right now, and some that I think, Gene, you also referenced. As a father now, I find myself in this very strange place where On the one hand, all the things I promised to myself when I was, flipping through flashcards when I was like in 4th grade, preparing for the SATs. I'm not kidding, right? And all these things which I said to myself that I wasn't going to do have all of a sudden become kind of appealing in a very, and not just because I see that, as you mentioned, Gene, some of the things that my parents told me I should have done and should have done better when I was a kid, I really do feel now I should have done and should have done better as a kid. But also, I see that it's not just other Asian kids who are in that situation. I hated Chinese school, Chinese language school, and I vowed I was never going to force my kids to do that. And of course, every Saturday, my sons now go to Chinese language school. The amazing thing is, it's in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, and of course, the vast majority of kids who go to this thing are, in fact, Chinese immigrants or children of Chinese immigrants. But a significant percentage, like about 10 or 15% of the kids there are not, as far as I can tell in any way, Chinese. And they're there because their parents have decided that their future, even though they're American, lies with China in some capacity. And the same can be said for all the other kind of enrichment classes and piano and all the other things that I'm doing that I feel terrible about. It's like it's no longer about us, about Chinese kids and Chinese immigrants. And actually, I feel in some ways that I'm terrible at it. I'm actually not as good as my parents were because I'm too soft-hearted, and I'm not able to actually sort of apply discipline really. I encourage, I'm friendly, I play video games with my kids. And at the same time, when I do feel the need to be a hard ass, I feel very guilty about that. So the question is this. There's a generation that's growing up who are not kids of immigrants, they're kids of the kids of immigrants. Their outlook is different. In fact, the very environment they're being raised in is different. In many cases, they're being raised in environments where being Asian is kind of normative. If you look at, for instance, people growing up in San Francisco, where over a third of the people in Metro San Francisco are Chinese or Asian, and in places like San Jose, for instance, you've got schools where the majority of kids from elementary school all the way through, if they go to Berkeley or Stanford or UCLA, are going to be plurality Asian. They're different. So how are they different? And what does that mean for us, their parents, or the people of the generation above them? Do they think completely differently from where we are and what we think?
I do the same thing as you, but I send my kid to Chinese school too. Although, at my kid's Chinese school, there are actually 2 different tracks. There's one track that is for the kids who come in knowing Chinese, who are, mostly of Chinese descent. And then there's a track that my kid's in. I think he's the only kid with Chinese blood in his class. Because I failed as a Chinese student. But yeah, I can speak as a teacher. I teach in Oakland, and there is a substantial number of Asian students at my school, even though it's nowhere near the majority. For several years, I was actually the moderator of the Asian Student Alliance, which meant that I hung out with Asian kids like all the time. But a few of the differences that I noticed between me and them is that it seems like, for the most part, a lot of them feel much more comfortable being Asian American than I did. Like a lot of them are able to switch between speaking in English and speaking in their native tongues with their friends, even though their English is perfect. A lot of them keep up with Asian pop culture. They watch Asian movies and they listen to Asian music. And there's not that weird sense of shame that was around me and my friends. I don't see them really picking on the FOB kids the way we did. We were really mean to the FOB kids. When I was in elementary school, I used to throw can bark at this one FOB kid. It was really terrible. Yeah, but that was all about this weird shame that I felt. And I just don't see it in them. But at the same time, at the school where I teach, my principal asked me to do GPAs by ethnicity, which is kind of funky, but I had to do GPAs by ethnicity, like average GPAs. The Asians were not on top. Yeah, they actually came in second to the whites. So maybe they should feel ashamed.
That's hilarious. What about you, Wesley, have you had a chance to actually talk to, I mean, because, again, I think there is something to be said that this particular sandwich generation, the kids of immigrants, and there are always going to be kids of immigrants. I mean, Asian Americans still, the vast majority of the growth of our population is coming from immigration, so there's always going to be the 1.5s and the 2s, after them. But there's a particular experience that the children of immigrants go through. And I wonder whether or not, especially now with the globalization, effects overlaying on top of the increased diversity of America itself, we're not seeing that a lot of these impulses are changing in ways that we can't predict or track.
I just spent 3 days in Atlanta at this. I read about an organization called Leadership Education for Asian Pacifics, which is dedicated to teaching Asians how to acquire leadership skills and to, in their own account, sort of overcome attachment to certain Asian values that might be holding them back in the workplace.
Fuck those values.
Yeah, I know. And there was a lot of there were a lot of like Indians from India and Chinese from China, and so a lot of the discussion, you could tell that the presentation was made in the 80s to address Asian Americans, because there's a lot of rhetoric about like being comfortable with yourself as an Asian person, and you could tell that in this audience of Chinese from China and Indians from India that was not really a message that they needed to hear anymore. Like, these people knew who they were, and they didn't have this kind of existential unease that was a part of the upbringing of a generation that came here after the 70s. And of course, so people that are third generation are going to be even more insulated, and they're insulated furthermore by their success and the middle class status of their parents. Those kids will be different. So in a way, there's this, Nick Lemon, who I was talking to about some of these issues, said that, yeah, like back in in the early 60s, Philip Roth wrote this book called Goodbye Columbus. It was perceived as very scandalous, and he was portrayed as a kind of self-hating Jew. But really, like, the book was full of this kind of anger against the self-imposed cultural barriers on the full expression of Philip Roth's ego and manhood, right? And of course, the weird thing about the book, the paradox of the book, but it's not really a paradox, is that it came out at precisely the moment that all these barriers were about to be swept away by a new generation of Jewish people. But it's not paradoxical in the sense that, like, there's a kind of cultural lag, and these expressions come out at the moment at like these certain inflection points. And I think it's clear that we're at one of those inflection points. And so the book that I write is going to sort of be about a kind of deracinated, supercilious, like racially ill-at-ease in itself person, like going to places like Monterey Park and Palisades Park and learning about Asian cultures and finding Asian people and learning about, like, in what ways, despite the reality that I am a deracinated, supercilious person, I am Asian, and I feel it, and can connect with other Asian people. And that's a process that's already begun, and that I'm sure is only going to continue over the next year or so.
Terrific. So we'll see what comes out of that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know myself. Anyway, so I think it's time now for us to kind of open up